I had been asking the iron hold for its scraps for 3 years, and for 3 years the most dangerous men in the kingdom had been lowering their heads to me at the gate, and not one of us would say why. That is the part I want you to hold on to, because the king certainly could not. 3 years. Every market day I came to the outer gate with my empty hands and asked the guards for whatever the kitchens had thrown out, and every market day a war captain or a battle-scarred general or one of the king's own sworn men would happen to be crossing the yard, and would see me, and would go still, and then would bow. Not a nod, not the half-courtesy a busy man gives a beggar to be rid of her. A bow, head down, the way a wolf lowers its head to the only wolf it will lower its head to. And then they would walk on, fast and not look back, and if you had asked them an hour later, they would have told you, honestly, that they had bowed to no one. I never explained it. Neither did they. That was the bargain none of us had ever spoken aloud, and it had held for 3 years, and it would have held for 30 more, if the king had not, one grey morning in the 3rd winter, finally happened to be standing on the wall above the gate when his hardest man went down to me like a reed. His name was Torvald. The king's, though I did not call him anything yet then, except trouble. He was the kind of man a hold builds itself around without quite meaning to. Tall, unhurried, certain of the ground under him in the particular way of men who have never once had it taken away. He ruled the iron territories the way other men breathe. He had never, in his life, not understood a room. So you can imagine what it did to him, watching Bronn, his second, a man who had killed 3 challengers and feared nothing that walked, stop dead in the yard and bow his grey head to a woman in rags at his own gate. I felt the king see it. I want to tell you I felt nothing else, but the truth is I had been careful for 3 years and I knew the exact weight of being watched, and the weight that came down on me from the wall that morning was new and heavy and did not lift when I turned to go. I got my scraps, a heel of bread, burnt, and the rind off a cheese. I thanked the guard, who would not meet my eyes, and I walked back out through the gate to the line where the King's Road becomes the common road, and I stopped there, at the line, the way I always stopped. 1 pace short of the world that was allowed to me, and 1 pace short of the one that was not. I never crossed back in past that gate uninvited. 3 years, and I had never once set my foot inside the wall. That line mattered more than I can tell you yet. Hold on to it too. I took my burnt bread down the hill to the others, because the scraps were never for me, they had never once been for me, but that is getting ahead of it, and I did not look back at the wall, and I felt him watching the whole way down. He came down to the gate himself the next market day. This is the thing about a man who has never not understood a room. When he meets a thing he cannot understand, he does not let it go. He came down out of his hold in plain dark wool, with no crown and no guard he would admit to, and he stood inside his own gate, on his side of the line, and he watched me ask for scraps, and when Bronn crossed the yard and went still and bowed, the king turned and looked at his second the way you look at a man you have known 20 years who has just spoken in a language you did not know he had. "Explain that," I heard him say. Low, an order. And Bronn, who feared nothing, looked at his king and looked at me and said, "I can't, my lord," and walked away. I have thought about that moment many times since. It was the first time in his life, I think, that Torvald gave an order in his own hold, and was simply, flatly, refused, not in defiance, but in something closer to grief. And he stood there with it, and then he turned his head and looked straight at me across the yard, and I understood the bargain of 3 years was over. "You," he said. "Beggar, come here." I did not come. I stood at my line with my burnt bread, and I said, "I'm not allowed past the gate, my lord. You'll have to come to me. Or send the bread out. I'll take either." The yard went very quiet. You do not speak to the Iron King that way. I knew it. I had spent 3 years being so quiet, so small, so exactly the size a beggar is supposed to be, and I do not to this day fully know what came over me, except that I was tired and cold, and 3 years is a long time to be bowed to by men who will not say your name. He came to the line. The king of the Iron Territories crossed his own yard and stopped 1 pace inside his gate, with the worn stone line between us, and he looked at me close for the first time, and something moved behind his face that he did not have a name for, and I did. "Who are you?" he said. "A woman who wants your scraps," I said, "and is getting them, so I can't complain. My generals bow to you." "Do they?" I looked past him at the empty yard, all innocence. How strange. I watched him decide he hated me a little, which is a thing I have since learned is the way he begins to love anyone, and I picked up my bread, and I bid him good day, and I went back down the hill, and I knew before I reached the bottom that he would follow me. Men like Torvald cannot bear a closed door. It is their great weakness, and, as it turned out, their only saving grace. He followed me 3 nights later, in the dark, the way a king should never go anywhere, alone and unarmed and on foot. What he found at the bottom of the hill is the part that shook his kingdom. There is a hollow below the common road where the wall's shadow falls, and the people the iron hold has no use for live in it. The old, the lame, the wolves who were cast out for being too weak to be worth feeding, and the children of wolves who were cast out, who never did anything at all except be born to the wrong rank. The hold does not look at them. The hold has trained itself not to. It is easy to forget a thing you have decided not to see, and the hold had been forgetting that hollow for 20 years. I went down into it that night with my burnt bread and the rind of cheese and the other things I had gathered through the week, and I did what I do, which is feed the ones who cannot feed themselves, and sit with the ones who are dying, and sing the small ones to sleep. Because somebody has to, and for 20 years the somebody had been me, and I did not know, until I heard the breath catch behind me, that the king had followed me down into the dark, and was standing at the edge of the hollow, watching a beggar woman he had been ready to have flogged for insolence kneel in the cold, and feed his forgotten people with the scraps off his own table. I did not turn around. I said, "To the dark, you're letting the cold in. Either come down and be useful, or go back up and be a king, but don't stand in the door." He came down. He did not say anything for a long while. He sat on a stone at the edge of the firelight, with his elbows on his knees, the most powerful man in 4 territories, and he watched an old wolf named Het, who had bled for Torvald's father in a war the hold had stopped telling stories about, take a bowl of thin broth from my hands, and bow his head over it, and then look up at his king across the fire, and bow that grey head again, the way Bronn had, the way they all did. "He bows to you," Torvald said quietly. "He won't bow to me. He bowed to my father, and he'll bow to you, but not to me. Why? And here is where I should have lied. 3 years of careful silence, and I should have lied one more time." But the firelight was on his face, and the face was not the face from the wall. It was younger, somehow, and lost, and it was the first time anyone had asked me the real question, and waited for the real answer instead of walking away. "Because your father took something from these people," I said, "and you've spent your whole reign not knowing it was gone. They bow to me because of what I am to them. They won't bow to you because of what your house did. And the reason no one will explain it to you, my lord, is that every man who would have to explain it was standing in the hall the day it was done." The fire snapped. Old Het would not look up. "What was taken?" Torvald said. I had not said it aloud in 20 years. I found my voice came out steadier than I felt. "A Luna. The true one. The one the old blood answers to, that your father set aside for a stronger alliance and a richer pack, and then made sure was forgotten so completely that her own line ended in a hollow under his wall. I met his eyes. Her name was Saiva. She was my mother, and every wolf old enough to remember her is bowing to the last of her, because the blood does not care what the politics decided. The blood knows it's Luna. It always has. You are the only wolf in this kingdom who didn't. I want to tell you he doubted me. It would be a more comfortable story if he had, but a wolf knows truth the way it knows its own name. And I watched 20 years of a thing he had never been told arrange itself behind his eyes into a shape that fit every silence he had ever lived inside. And he put his face in his hands, the king of the Iron Territories, in a beggar's hollow, and he did not make a sound. After a while he lifted his head. The fire had burned low, and old Het had not moved, and the king looked at him the way you look at a man you have wronged, without ever learning his name. "And the others," Torvald said. "Bronn, my war captains. Half of them were boys when your mother was set aside, or not yet born. They don't bow to a bloodline they never saw, so why them? Because of what I am to them now." I tipped my head toward the old wolf across the fire. "Not what my mother was. Ask Het why he bows." The old wolf's voice came out of the dark like a stone settling into place. "She sat with my wife 3 nights when the fever came," he said, "when the hold sent no one, because we were nothing to it. She closed my wife's eyes at the end. I had no coin and nothing to give, and she never once asked for any." He looked at his king, steady as iron. "A man bows to that, my lord. A man bows to that long before he bows to a crown." And it went around the fire then, quiet, the way the truth goes around a fire. The lame wolf, whose children I had fed through the famine winter, the girl I had taught her letters by the coals, the old woman whose grief I had simply sat inside of, night after night. Because grief that is sat inside of is grief survived. None of them had ever told a living soul. Each had carried his own small debt up to the gate and set it at my feet in the only coin he had left, which was the bow, and not one of them had been able to explain it to his king. Because how do you tell the Iron King that a beggar in rags had been doing the work his crown was meant for? Torvald listened to all of it without moving, and I watched the last comfortable thing in him come quietly apart. The belief that his hold had been whole, that his long peace had been real, that the silence at his gate had ever been anything but the sound of 100 private shames. It is a strange thing to comfort a man for a crime that was committed against you. I did it anyway. That is, I have come to understand. Simply who I am. I'll stop us there a breath, by the low fire, before the rest of it. Because if you've come this far with me, to a gate and a line, and a king kneeling in a hollow he never knew was his, then I think you'd want the next of these to find you, and following along is the only way it will. That's the whole of my asking tonight. Now, the morning after, and the man who had the most to lose by my still breathing. He came back the night after that. Not as a king with questions. He had run out of questions, I think, or grown afraid of the answers, but just as a man, down the hill in his plain dark wool, sitting on his stone at the edge of my fire, as though he had been doing it for years. The first night he only watched. The second, I put him to work. Because I cannot abide a useless thing by my fire, and because I wanted to see what the Iron King would do if a beggar handed him a ladle. He looked at it the way he had looked at the soup bowl of broth in old Het's hands, as if it were a language he did not speak. And then, because there is more to him than the wall ever showed, he took it. And he ladled broth into the bowls of the people his house forgot, badly, slopping half of it, and he did not once complain about the half he spilled on his fine boots. "You've never done a humble thing in your life," I told him, watching him try. "No," he said, "he considered it, the way he considers everything, slow and whole. I have never been refused either, did you know that? Not once, not a request, not an order, not a door. I say a thing, and the world arranges itself around the saying of it." He filled another bowl, steadier now. "And then a beggar at my own gate told me to come to her or send the bread out. I have thought about it every day since. I did not know a person could simply decline me. I have spent 30 years being agreed with. It is the loneliest thing in the world, and I never had the word for it until you made me walk to a line in my own yard. I did not have a dry answer for that. I am usually good for one. I knelt and tended the fire instead, because the hands can do a thing when the rest of you has gone somewhere it cannot account for." "My father was never refused either," he said, quieter. "I used to think that was strength. I am beginning to think it is how a man comes to set aside a lunar and bury a line under his own wall and sleep soundly for 20 years. No one ever stood at his gate and would not cross it. He looked at me across the fire, and the firelight did the thing to his face it had done the first night. You have been refusing this hold for 3 years, every time you stopped at that line and would not come in. I thought it was deference. It was the opposite, wasn't it? It was the only honest thing left standing at my gate." "It was both," I said. "A woman can know exactly what she's owed and still not be fool enough to walk uninvited into a house that ended her mother. The line kept me alive, my lord. I didn't draw it to be proud. I drew it to remember." He was quiet a long moment. Then he held his hand out across the fire, not to take anything, just held it out, open. The way you offer a hand to a thing that has been hurt and might not want it, and he left it there, in the warm air between us, and he did not reach the rest of the way. I looked at that open hand a long time. I had spent 20 years not taking the things this hold offered, because every offering had a price and the price was always me. I took it. A heartbeat too long, and then I let go, and neither of us said anything about it, and the wolf in him, I felt it, the way I had felt it bow in the firelight at Het, settled, the way a thing settles when it has finally been allowed to rest. "You should go up." I started gathering the empty bowls. Kings are missed. "Not as much as you'd think," he said, and stayed another hour anyway, and that was the night I stopped thinking of him as the king, and started thinking of him as a man I was going to have a great deal of trouble over, which is a far more dangerous thing to do. The trouble started in earnest the next morning, and it did not come from him. It came from Lord Osric, the king's chancellor, the keeper of the hold's law and its longer memory, a thin grey man who had served Torvald's father before him, and who had been, 20 years ago, a young man standing in the hall the day a Luna was set aside. He had spent 2 decades making certain the hollow stayed forgotten, because a forgotten crime is a survivable one, and a remembered crime that the old blood is already bowing to is a knife at the throat of everything he had built his life on. He came to me at the gate, alone, with his chain of office hidden under a plain cloak, which told me exactly how frightened he was. "You will leave," he said. "Tonight the hold will be generous. There is a road west, and gold for the walking of it. And a beggar who takes such an offer is a wise woman. A beggar who refuses it tends to be found face down in the spring melt." He smiled, thin as a blade. "Your mother refused to be wise too. Look where her line ended." It was the second time in my life a powerful person had threatened my life with my mother's name in their mouth, and the first time I understood it was the same crime, 20 years apart, wearing the same grey face. "You should be careful, my lord," I said, telling a woman the king's whole court is bowing to that she'd be easy to make disappear. Someone might mistake it for a confession. His face did not move, but his hand did, on the gate's iron, a small white tightening, and I knew I had made an enemy who would not threaten twice. Men like Osric only warn you once. After that they simply act. He acted 4 days later at the choosing. The choosing is the oldest rite the hold keeps, the day the king stands before the full court and the old blood, and names, or does not name, his Luna. Torvald had let it pass empty for years. Everyone assumed he would let it pass empty again. Osric had other plans, and he had spent 4 days making them, a strong daughter of a strong pack, brought to the hall, an alliance dressed as a destiny, the same trick his master had pulled 20 years before, run a second time to bury the same truth a second time. Name a safe Luna in front of everyone, and the matter of a beggar in a hollow becomes a madwoman's tale. I was not invited. Beggars are not invited to a choosing. But I had stopped, somewhere in those 4 days, being willing to stand at my line, and I walked up the hill in my grey rags through a gate that no one quite dared close in my face, because by then every guard on the wall knew exactly whose daughter I was, and not one of them would be the man who barred the Luna's blood from the hall. That is how I came to be standing at the back of the great hall of the Iron Kings, in my rags, when Osric presented his safe bride, and the court murmured its relief, and the king sat on the wolf throne with a face like a shut door. And then Torvald stood, and the hall went silent, and he did not look at the bride at all. He looked at me, at the back, by the door, at my line, the one I had carried with me all the way into his hall. "There is a debt this hold has not paid," he said, "for 20 years. I did not know of it. That is my shame, and I will wear it. But I know of it now." He came down off the dice, down the length of that hall, past the strong bride and her strong pack, and his thin grey chancellor going the colour of ash, and the whole court turned like a single animal to watch their king walk the length of his own hall toward a beggar. My father set aside the true Luna of this blood, and let her line end in the cold under our wall. The old among you know it. You have bowed to it for 3 years at my gate, and said nothing out of shame, and I do not blame you, because I would have done the same. He stopped 1 pace from me, from the line. I am done doing the same. And then the Iron King, in front of his full court, his strong bride, his chancellor, the old blood, all of it, went down on 1 knee to a beggar woman in rags, and lowered his head. I felt it happen before I saw it. Behind him, around the hall, the old wolves went down. Het would not have been there, but Bron was, and Bron went to his knee, and the war captains, and the grey men who had stood in this hall 20 years ago and carried it ever since, and last of all, the king's own wolf rose in him, and bowed where the man already had. The great proud beast of him lowering its head to the last of a line his house had tried to erase, and the hall that had bowed to me in secret for 3 years finally did it in the light. You could have heard a heel of bread drop. I know, because mine did. Get up, I told him, and my voice was not steady at all now. You'll start a war kneeling to a beggar. Let it start, he said, into the stone. I've spent my reign keeping a peace built on a buried woman. I find I've stopped wanting it. That is when Osric moved. He had spent his life in the longer memory of the hold, and the longer memory of the hold is full of knives, and he had one in his sleeve the way his kind always does, and he came across that hall not for the king, never for the king. You cannot kill a king in his own hall and live, but for me, the proof, the loose stone, the thing that would unbuild 20 careful years if it kept breathing. The court was watching the kneeling king. No one was watching the chancellor. I was. I have spent my whole life watching the hand that is about to strike. You learn it. In a hollow under a wall, you learn to read a blow before it lands. I did not freeze. I stepped in, toward him, not away, and I got my hand up, and the knife meant for the soft of me opened my palm to the bone instead, and I closed that ruined hand around the blade, and I held, the way I have held dying men, and frightened children, and the cold itself, and I did not let it go further than my hand. It bought a heartbeat. With Torvald, a heartbeat has always been enough. He had Osric by the wrist before the second strike, and the knife rang on the stone of the hall, and the king held his father's chancellor in front of the whole bowing court with my blood running bright down both our arms. And he did not kill him. That is the thing they still tell in the Iron Hold. The king who did not kill the man who tried to finish his father's crime. He took the chain of office, and the name, and the place, and he sent Osric past the last marker with the mark of an oathbreaker cut, where every pack from here to the sea would read it, which is worse, as anyone who has lived among wolves will tell you. And he had the hollow under the wall opened, that same day, and its people brought up through the gate, every one of them, across the line, into the light, by his own order and his own hand, including me. He took my unhurt hand, and he drew me across the worn stone line of his own gate that I had not crossed in 3 years, and he did it slowly, so that the whole court could see exactly where the line had been, and exactly that it was gone, and somewhere in the crossing of it, the careful, frozen. No one's life I had built in a hollow came apart all at once, quiet, like a thing that had only ever been waiting for someone to call it by its right name. He kissed me there, on the line, with the blood still on my hand, and I will not tell you about it except that it undid 20 years of being unseen, and that when it was done I was weeping, and so, I am told, was half the hall, and so, though he will deny it forever, was the king. A year on, near to the day, there is no line at the gate of the Iron Hold. He had the stone taken up. There is just the gate now, open, and a road that runs both ways through it, and a hollow below the wall that is a village now, with roofs, and bread that is not burnt, and old Het at a hearth he does not have to share with the cold. There is a chair beside the king's at the high table, and the woman in it wears no rags, though she keeps one grey scrap folded in a drawer to remember by, and there is a long pale scar across her right palm that aches before rain, At every feast, it is her hand that breaks the first loaf and carries it down the hall to the lowest table first, before the high one is served, because that is what a Luna is, it turns out, under all the gold and the politics and the 20 buried years. Not the strongest, not the highest born, just the one the blood bows to, because she is the one who feeds the pack that no one else will see. The old wolves still bow to me. They bow in the light now, and they say my name when they do it, and the saying of it after 20 years of silence is a thing I do not have steady words for, so I will not try. But here is the part I keep. On the morning of that first choosing, walking up the hill in my rags toward a hall I had no right to enter, I had thought I was going to lose. I had thought the safe bride would be named, and the truth would be buried again, and I would go back to my hollow, and my burnt bread, and my line at the gate. Because that is how these things go, for women like the one I was. I had forgotten the oldest law there is, the one that runs under all the others, older than the king, older than his crown, older than his father's crime. The blood knows its Luna. It always has. It just took the proudest man in the kingdom 3 winters and a knife through my hand to find out what his own court had known all along. So tell me, did you see it, before he did, that the scraps were never once for her? And wherever you are listening from tonight, a high hall or a low hollow, or somewhere with its own line drawn across the floor that no one will explain to you, come across it. Leave the latch off, keep the fire low, and follow along, and I will have another for you next week. Her side of it, the way these are always told. The quiet women, it turns out, are the strongest wolves in the room. I always suspected. It only took them 20 years to bow.